Obviously, last week, Keir Starmer had this chaos in his government. He's had this huge reshuffle.
Shush. This was a reset. This was a further phase in the triumphant march of the, I believe it's called Project, the Starmer Project. Yes, please.
Well, like he said, summer is over.
These deeply prejudicial remarks.
Well, listen, I want to go through this reset, as you call it, cabinet reshuffle and so on, following the resignation of Angela Rayner. Let's start with the new Home Secretary, Shabana Mahmood. What do you make of this selection as Home Secretary?
You could argue that Starmer had been incredibly clever, that the appointment, as it were, appeases the extraordinary influence of Islam within the Labour Party. I mean, the whole reason why there has been this fuss about the concealment of the vileness and scale of the operations of the rape gangs, which aren't really gangs at all, they're clans, they're cousin-ages and whatever, is precisely because the Labour Party depends on having stitched up several constituencies in the North and the Midlands especially, through the fact that they are now well over 50% Muslim, and that the entire machinery of local government, the police and the Labour Party, all sit in a nexus controlling these things and delivering seats and delivering votes. But of course, the whole thing now being threatened with the profound divisions within the Labour Party, again, unthinkable a few years ago, foreign policy, the issue, do you support, as Starmer broadly does, famously with a Jewish wife and children being brought up in the Jewish faith, do you broadly support Israel? Or, as huge swathes, especially of the left of the Labour Party, and of course, almost to a man, these Muslim communities, do you support Hamas? Explicitly, openly.
Let's talk about Islam in British politics and the kind of novel nature of senior politicians being Muslim or Islamic. So in the Home Office, there is a 700-person strong, or maybe even more than that by now, Muslim network, Islamic network that I reported on last year. I know people in the Home Office, and there are serious concerns that some of these people are governing asylum cases in which, say, a Christian or an apostate is fleeing from, say, Iran, and then a Muslim Home Office asylum seeker case officer gets to make that decision, so as to whether they get asylum or not. And there's a bit of a conflict of interest there. But just more broadly,
there's a much clearer we need to talk more about this. There are these cases now where it is actually known that the process, not so much of asylum, I think, but the general processes of settlement and so on, were granting of citizenship, were deliberately manipulated. Because again, let's call things by their proper names. These people come from societies where what we call corruption is the ordinary way in which you do business. I mean, remember, we've completely forgotten that we in the West are very unusual. The idea that you don't have backhanders, the idea that you don't do favors to your friends and your cousins and your sisters and your great aunts is, in much of the world, do you know what, is regarded as wrong. This that you're dealing with actually clashing. It's not simply goodies and baddies. You're actually dealing with Hegelian tragedy. You're dealing with a clash of different moral systems, which is why, of course, they so often look so outraged. I mean, the whole business of underage sex, it isn't underage for them. Again, the whole notion that a woman who is not modestly dressed, and the degrees of clothing that are required to establish modesty seem to acquire extra layers and extra covers virtually every minute that goes by, is prey. A woman who is not Muslim is legitimate prey. This is the world we've got ourselves into. So we have now people being elected to office. You look now at an extraordinary procession of mayors in local government with this bizarre mixture of the mock traditional Victorian robes of office, and the scarlet and the fur and the chains and the cocked hats and whatever, with this extraordinary discordant figure encased in them. one sees it, of course, with someone denounced by President Trump, Mayor Khan in London, Abu the former Chief Minister of Scotland, Humza Useless, as he's rather unfortunately called. Again, figures who clearly, with Khan, I should pull back. He manages to walk a very tight precipice. But if you look in Scotland, it was perfectly clear that as it were, the foreign side of the personality, the foreign side of their loyalties is prioritized over any other. And this is increasingly the case. And of course, it comes with so many other things. It is now coupled with what has not happened in England since really the early Middle Ages. England, again, very, very unusual, because the power of the monarchy meant that everybody, even the most powerful people in the land, were subject to the king's justice. But now we have indeed, there are not many of them, but they do exist. There are actually areas where effectively different law applies. We've got, and of course, it's now being answered by the native population, and the whole. We've now got a war of flags. In other words, mainland Britain has started to go the same way as Ulster. In Ulster, it's the division between the Irish tricolour of the nationalists, the Catholic nationalists, and the Union Jack of the Loyalists and the Protestants. Now we're seeing the war between the Union Jack and the St. George's Cross of patriots, right-wing patriots. They would rejoice in the term being right-wing. They would repudiate the term far-right. And those who increasingly fly either the Pakistani flag or, more particularly, the Hamas flag.
This seems to be more religious than politically motivated. When you look at somewhere like Yugoslavia, maybe that's a better example than the 1920s, 1930s. You talk about the Sharia courts in the UK. According to a report in the Times last year, there are 85 Sharia courts in Britain. Britain has become the capital of Western Europe when it comes to Sharia law. Over 100,000 Islamic marriages were processed in Britain. And to get a divorce under these Sharia courts, an Islamic man just has to say the word divorce 3 times. So it's quite an interesting two-tier system that's going on. But I want to ask about Zia Youssef as well. I mean, he was the chairman of Reform. He still holds a senior position in that party. He is a Muslim. There's also Lila Cunningham, a senior member of the party who is a councillor. In principle, are you opposed, or do you think that there is anything wrong with senior politicians, left or right, being Muslims in British politics? Do you think is that Islamophobic? Some people have said this is Islamophobic to raise concerns around that, or bigoted in some way, especially if they're moderate Muslims.
This is a profoundly difficult issue, and one on which I confess my opinion changes with the person, changes with the moment. I think I have profound doubts in principle, because what is a moderate Muslim? Islam is not Christianity. Christianity has a clear sense of a division between church and state. Even when you had the period, we were talking about imperial, even in the period when you had an imperial papacy and the Pope thought himself he was above secular powers, there was still, as Jesus himself said, there was still a space for the secular power. In Islam, there is not. Or at least there is not in theory. Islam is not simply a religion, it's a complete program for a way of life, and there is no separation whatever between church and state in the ideal community of Islam. Instead, there is the caliphate, in which the caliph, as a descendant of the Prophet, holds all power in all spheres. As, of course, I suppose we could say Henry VIII briefly, not for too long did, in Britain, but clearly the position with Islam is much more clear-cut. Now, this means, of course, and also there is the other tradition, that there is a notion in Islam that truth is conditional, that the degree of truth-telling to somebody who does not belong to Islam that you are obliged to perform is not the same as to a fellow Muslim. This raises absolutely fundamental questions about loyalty. And what I think, Stephen, is very interesting, and this is how I've been approaching the question with friends. I have friends on all sides of the political spectrums, of all kinds of religious belief, including those who are Muslim, including those who are Sikh in particular, those who are Hindu. And the most interesting example is what we had in English politics. For many years following Henry VIII, we had a state which had very good reason to doubt the honesty and commitment to the state of Roman Catholics. That there was a profound sense that the English state, because it was Protestant, was illegitimate, and the English monarch was not the proper king, and indeed, for a significant stretch of time, was subject to assassination as a virtuous act. We tend to think that what we call the terrorism of Islam is something new. It's not, or something unheard of. It's not. We had exactly, you I think were wrong when you said that the divisions now are essentially religious. I think they're politico-religious. The thing that has activated them more than anything else is Hamas and the struggle in the Middle East. Again, you see the most explicit forms that they take for things like the celebration of the Pakistani National Day. The entire vast town hall of Birmingham was lit up in the colours of Pakistan. Never have I seen it lit up in red, blue, and white. So I think it's the fact that if you have a religion which claims superiority to the state, then at the back of your head, whatever they say and whatever they do, you have that rattling sense. These questions are inescapable. And again, we solved them. We solved them in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries in Britain in a way which was very much more civilized than that elsewhere in Europe. Elsewhere in Europe, the religious gulf of Protestant and Catholic was by and large solved by overt and brutal persecution. And again, just to give you an example, I mean, you're interested in history, we tend to think of Belgium, the southern Netherlands, as naturally Catholic, and the north, Holland, as naturally Protestant. That was not true. The great centres of Protestantism were in what was then the hugely prosperous south. It was the savage persecutions of the Spanish after the 1560s, coupled with confiscation of property, especially the property of exiles, and driving people into exile, that brought about a complete population shift. Similarly, the expulsion of the Huguenots by Louis XIV is one of the great shifts of French political life. There were whole swathes of France, particularly in the south and the highlands in the centre of France, the Massif Central, where Protestantism was dominant, and it was driven out. And that leads to that remarkable proclamation by John Stuart Mill in his great treatise on liberty: persecution works if it's sufficiently savage and sufficiently persistent. We didn't do it. We did not persecute, in any formal sense of the word, individual Catholics. They were fined. It's very English. You were fined for not going to church. Few pennies if you were poor, and significantly more if you weren't. But what we did, we attacked the clergy, particularly those who believed in the supremacy of the Pope, that's to say, Jesuits. And coming into Britain for a stretch of time as a Jesuit when things were at their height. Because remember, when we all joke about Bonfire Night and Guy Fawkes, what he aimed to do was exactly what we saw Israel trying to do yesterday with Hamas. He aimed to decapitate an entire country. He aimed to blow up the opening of Parliament, which would have blown up the king, the royal family, the bishops, the peers, the MPs, the judges. In other words, to do 3 towers on 10 times the scale, proportionately. So, but what we do is we learn with a judicious mixture of stick and carrot to break that. Until by the time you're into the late 17th century, and especially into the 18th, the fundamental loyalty of even deeply religious Catholics to the British state is clear. And it may be, and if you actually look, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, have now started rigorous vetting of imams, of making sure that those who espouse the most radical versions of Islam are simply not allowed to hold positions. We have not begun even to tackle this in Britain. But what we will have to do, I'm absolutely certain, in order, and I'm going to use a cruel word, to defang Islam, we are going to have to resort to exactly the same sort of machinery that was used to defang radical Catholicism.
I like your discussion of history, obviously. You didn't mention the English Civil War. I mean, obviously there was a religious factor to that, but we don't have to go down a rabbit hole there. I do want to ask about, again, coming back to Starmer's cabinet, Mahmood is the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper is the Foreign Secretary, and Rachel Reeves remains as the Chancellor. Now, a Times journalist tweeted saying this was basically a historic moment for Britain because for the first time we have 3 women filling the 3 great offices of state, obviously excepting the Prime Minister. So, David Starkey, is this a historic turning point for our country? We have 3 women in those offices.
What a preposterous notion. I mean, this is the kind of thing that brings political commentary into disrepute. Either you believe that men and women are equally good or equally bad, in other words, that they're an awfully mixed bag, or you find yourself uttering nonsense like that. I don't think it makes the slightest difference. I mean, I think that again, I am afraid, looking at the performance of this government, you could put forward a very, very striking argument that the position of both the Labour and indeed the Conservative Party since 2010, that you need a gender balance is required. The results, where we've had such a period of utterly disastrous government from both parties, suggest that maybe the old way of doing, there might have been something to be said for the old way of doing things, and it is worth thinking. Men and women are different. That the whole, again, the wonderful thing with transgenderism is that the whole nonsense argument that sex is gender, therefore it's simply a social construct, was invented by radical feminism, which has now hoisted radical feminism by its own petard in a wonderfully vigorous way, because it is perfectly clear that the differences are absolutely fundamental, and they're not simply biological. If you actually look in Britain at the moment, and I think the same is true in America, there is a marked gender difference in politics. The standard remark in America, look at liberal women, and the same is true here. If you particularly look at the younger generations, where the political shifts on issues like woke and whatever are so very striking, young men are going sharply to the left. Women remain sharply to the right. Women remain firmly on the left.
Now, David, I want to ask about someone who was shuffled out of his job last week into a new role. This is David Lammy. He's now the Deputy Prime Minister. Now, he was a mastermind.
No. It's worse. He's also Lord Chancellor. He is again the successor of St. Thomas More and Cardinal Wolsey.
Well, let me ask you,
I used to let me have my rant, please. I used to weep at the thought of Lammy sitting in Palmerston's desk, but the idea of Lammy wearing the robes of Thomas More, they're there in the Holbein of Cardinal Wolsey, and you weep. I'm being now serious. You weep for England. There is an absolute, and this is not a term of abuse, we have his unwise appearance on Celebrity Mastermind, where when he was asked which French woman is involved in the development of radiation and whatever, he says Marie Antoinette. When he's asked who is the successor, and this shows not simply that he doesn't know history, but that he can't count. When he is asked who is the successor of Henry VIII, he says Henry VII. Now, look, this is, again, I've got to maybe you can help me out here. How does somebody with a brain like J.D. Vance pretend to get on well with somebody like that? I mean, it is a deep mystery, isn't it?
Let's talk about two people who have kept their jobs in this reset, reshuffle. That's Rachel Reeves and Ed Miliband, obviously two of Starmer's most important political allies, and I'm sure that the Prime Minister thinks most effective ministers. What do you make of these two keeping their jobs?
Well, the rumours are that, and again, I have no notion of the truth of this. The rumour is that that Starmer did his very best to move Miliband on, and that Miliband simply flatly refused demotion to whatever was offered to him. It's very clear why Starmer wanted to get rid of him. There is increasing shift of public opinion on the whole question of climate change and how we should respond to it, the response of net zero. The policies, and again, it's really important we say this, begun under New Labour, but continued and intensified under the Conservatives, with the biggest single change being Theresa May in 2015, is it 2015? No, it must be 2016, when you actually legislate net zero as binding by 2050, which gives judges actually control over extractive policy and energy policy. But the whole this entire structure of the reckless pursuit of net zero has led us to the condition where, as we all know, or perhaps on the other side of the Atlantic, it isn't known, our electricity prices are 4 times those of the United States of America. They have led to an extraordinary position in which all our major fuel-intensive industries like steel and chemicals, steel was relatively minor in the British economy, but chemicals and pharmaceuticals, major, are under effectively a sentence of death. They simply cannot continue. You're out of line, not simply with America, you're grossly out of line with Europe. And it seems, again, it's really important to understand this. Figures like Miliband are genuinely priests of a religion. He is a fanatic. You look at him when he's talking about this, despite every scrap of evidence pointing to the fact that this reckless pursuit of net zero is not simply leading to gigantically high prices, but to leading to deindustrialization, leading again to complete absurdities, with the sponsoring of wind farms in the remote parts of the British Isles, with an underdeveloped network of transition. You are now spending not far short of £1 billion a year paying electricity companies not to generate power. And the thing is simply a lunacy. And again, it's typical of what happens when a fanatic is put in charge of policy. There's a complete loss of balance. And this, again, Stephen, I think is something we need to think about very seriously. Increasingly, on both sides of the Atlantic, there has been a tendency to think that politicians really are too dim to be given access to major issues of policy, especially major issues of policy that have got long-term significance, like energy development, and therefore it needs to be given to those who are experts and passionate believers in it. The consequences are disastrous. What you need is the proper weighing of the pursuit, for example, of net zero against general economic development, against the risk to industrial growth, and above all, of course, the elementary application of proportion. Britain has one of the smallest emissions of any developed country for the simple reason that we deindustrialize. So most of the stuff we generate is most of the products we consume are made abroad. So we actually produce 1% of world global emissions. Whatever we do is not of faintest effect. It has absolutely no consequence. And again, it's part of what has increasingly come to govern British policy, which is not reality, but words. We are told we have to do this to set a good example. It's like the whole business of belonging to the ECHR, even though it is limiting in such obvious ways, and indeed producing gross injustices over the handling of asylum seekers, foreign criminals, and so on. We're told we've got to do it to set a good example. This is madness. I mean, the one thing that I think is wonderful about Trump, and there are many things which are not wonderful, is the unashamed putting of America first. The politicians of a country have a prime and absolute duty to their own people, and everything else is guff. And we, unfortunately, have absorbed guff. We are ruled by guff. And somebody like Miliband is pure guff. As interestingly, I would argue, is Rachel Reeves. Rachel Reeves presents herself as this sober figure, this serious people, grown-up people with a proper economic policy, stabilizing the economy, indeed at rock bottom, in contrast with wicked creatures like Liz Truss. But remember, and I keep banging on, and I think people are beginning now to understand it. Everybody is puzzled. Why is nothing moving in Britain? Because you have an economics minister, because that's what the Chancellor of the Exchequer means. You have an economics minister with a completely crazy theory of the economy. I mean, we laughed at Rachel Reeves, all of that stuff, Rachel from accounts and whatever. That gets her wrong. It doesn't do her justice. She was the prime ideologue of Starmer's Labour Party, and she actually delivers authoritative lectures on the economy, on economics. She gave the Mace lecture. That's the most important lecture in political economy in the City of London in March, I think it was, of last year, March 2024, in the run-up to the election, in which she talks about having a new economic doctrine, a thing called securonomics, or modern supply-side economics. And the economic theory behind this is economies grow by public spending. They grow by public spending on roads, on infrastructure, on green power, on investment in healthcare, and so on. In other words, it's a form of disguised Keynesianism. In other words, that you throw large quantities of public money and the economy churns around. It's also, of course, what's even more interesting, as I constantly point out, it's directly derived from America, because we all think of the right in Britain as being obsessed with America, all the stuff about Farage occasionally running around like a lapdog behind Donald Trump. But the left is just as lapdog in its behavior. Virtually everything that Gordon Brown did in Britain was directly taken from America and from American political theory. And similarly, Rachel Reeves was directly imitating Janet Yellen. And indeed, when I went through her Mace lecture, there's a wonderful summary of the problem with Reeves, which was given actually by a former editor of the New Statesman, Jason Cowley. Bidenomics without the bucks. At least Biden was able to borrow. We're not in a position where we can borrow. So you have, in other words, an economic theory, which, you know what, again, what is so terrible? You mentioned some of the figures at the beginning, people like Torsten Bell, that the people who were behind this theory have now actually been put into major positions in the Treasury and Downing Street. So rather than backing off, as you could arguably say Starmer was doing with the appointment of Mahmoud and whatever, they're doubling down on this nonsense. Anybody who wants to bet against the success of the British economy has got a one-way certain bet.
So, David, with that in mind, how concerned are you with the upcoming budget?
Oh, I think it will be appalling. The signals are completely clear. They have locked themselves into a position where they can't increase income tax, they can't increase the main rate of corporation tax, and they can't increase VAT. So what they will do is they will pile on taxes on property and other forms of wealth, which are exactly the kind of thing which are guaranteed to drive away seriously rich people. And again, there is this extraordinary myth on the left that the rich don't pay tax. If you actually look in Britain, the top 1% of taxpayers, I think, pay 1/3 of all income tax. It's extraordinary. More than half the population of Britain are net recipients of state handouts. So we've now got ourselves in this position. Do you know what? It's very, very much like, and people have now started to recognize this, it's very much like the position in the run-up to the French Revolution. You have got a privileged class. Back in the French Revolution, it was the nobility and church. Now it's the state sector and those who were state dependent, the recipients of various forms of welfare, public sector housing, the chronically sick and so on, who depend on the rest and are a privileged group. And of course, they and their handlers and their managers in the Labour Party form this state-dependent class. Yeah. And the Labour government, of course, is the quintessence of this. You may remember when it first came in, I labelled it government to parody Lincoln, government of the blob, by the blob, for the blob. So it cannot reform itself. I mean, this is the really interesting thing about Starmer. With this huge majority, he can't do anything. Now, it's partly just because most Labour MPs are people, they are those who believe in the sob story. They're those who were in the charitable sector, those who were in local government, those who are in universities and whatever. They're the ones for whom compassion is this key word, which means the right to put your hand in somebody else's pocket.
I want to ask one question about the opposition party reform. They had their conference last week during this kind of chaotic period for Starmer, in which we saw gaiety, we saw camp sort of speeches and singing and things like that. What did you make of Reform's conference? Was this the next party of government? Was this a serious party?
I was there. Not as a member of Reform, I remain a member of the Conservative Party, but in two capacities. As a member of the group called PopCon, Popular Conservative, we've been pushing forward this idea that what's gone wrong with Britain, as I was saying about Rachel Reeves and about the Blob, is systemic. That's to say that our government, the structures of our government were perverted. From 1997 onwards, our government and law were perverted, and the only way we can actually get the right way up again is by a great repeal of all Blair's legislation, and a restoration of the position of 1997. And what's striking, Stephen, is when I settled down to debate that, despite the fact that Nigel Farage had decided to bring forward his speech because, of course, of that chaos, the fact Angela Rayner was capturing all the news headlines, and dear Nigel is not used to having other people capturing news headlines, so he brought forward his speech. We still mustered several hundred people to listen to us. And as his speech gave way to another fireworks display and nonsense, we finished up with over 500 people listening to that serious debate. And the following day, when we reprised that debate with myself and Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is highly sympathetic to these ideas, with a group that is actually working to develop the necessary legislative program for that repeal, the Prosperity Institute, we got even bigger numbers. There were people standing 5 deep. So in other words, what struck me about it was most of the membership are really serious. Much of the leadership is frivolous. And the great problem are the kind of people that they're recruiting from the Conservative Party. Do you really want Andrea Jenkins? Do you really want Nadine Dorries? Do you really want Jake Berry? I mean, Jake Berry, net zero enthusiast believer in mass immigration. I do not understand what they think they're doing with that. But again, let's put the other side of the coin, Stephen. These are early days. They're feeling their way. But Mark Littlewood and I, and that's to say the core figures in PopCon, we've been touring the country. We're visiting about 3 local reform or conservative associations every week. So we're now in the high scores everywhere. I mean, this week I've been in Southampton. I was in Dublin yesterday. That's on a different matter. Today, and this evening, I'm going to be in Coventry. And do you know what? There is an extraordinary new seriousness. I mean, I've been to numerous political associations, and the standard Conservative association, you have too good a dinner. You all end up a bit drunk and a bit bloated. And then there are the key things of the auction and the raffle. That really is it. And if you're invited to speak, there's a palpable sense of begrudgment if you get in the way, particularly of the raffle. Suddenly that's changed. People are aware there is a political crisis. They want, there's a genuine sense of, please try to explain it to me. And I think that this grassroots, it is a grassroots feeling. I think it's starting. There are people, again, using religious language, using the language of Jesus. The people are hungry and they're not being fed. Because, of course, we've had a politics which has deliberately not taken people seriously, which has been crude and manipulative, has relied on the propagation of lies, like the wonderful virtues of multiculturalism and the importance, absolute importance of net zero. And suddenly, I think, thanks in particular to Elon Musk and breaking the leftish monopoly on Twitter, suddenly the barriers are down. Suddenly the unsayable is sayable, the unthinkable is thinkable, and people are wanting to debate and to discuss. And that seems to me, and it's not just me saying this, I don't know whether somebody who I thought would be a deeply hostile witness, Fraser Nelson, the former editor of The Spectator, now Times columnist, said exactly what I'm saying in his report, very extensive report, I thought, very well balanced. It's not, I don't always regard his work at all, as you know. I've often argued against it vigorously. But he highlighted the two meetings that I've just talked about as showing the genuine seriousness of the members and saying, with this kind of grassroots involvement and enthusiasm, and again, some of it, okay, I mean, I find it all very silly, but it is the sort of Trumpian razzmatazz. It's the import of this into British politics, which we really haven't had before. I mean, the pageantry in British politics was almost entirely on the left. The trade union marches with the banners, the Durham Miners Gala, all that sort of stuff. And this clearly is profoundly influenced by what's happened on the other side of the Atlantic. But I think underpinning it in exactly the same way as underpinning the flag waving and the driving around to pop music and the indoor fireworks and light displays of Trump, there is that serious element of Steve Bannon and MAGA. And I think there is a similar foundation.